They were chained in fields, stripped of freedom, reduced to nothing but numbers in a ledger. But what history hides is darker. Black male slaves were secretly pulled into filthy circles of power, controlled by white women whose society painted as pure. These were not whispers. These were dirty power rings, networks of silence and cruelty, where obsession, desire, and sadism collided in ways so disturbing that even centuries later, the truth is hard to face. Listen, hear the sounds, chains dragging in the dirt, the muffled laughter of a plantation party echoing from the great house, and then sudden silence. A door closes, footsteps fade, the room is locked. This is where the hidden power begins. Not in the daylight, not in the cotton rows, but in the shadows where no one was supposed to look. White women in lace dresses and polished pearls, portrayed as fragile and angelic, the perfect images of Southern virtue. But behind the facade of purity, many held powers sharp enough to wound, cruel enough to break spirits, and dirty enough to be buried for centuries. They were not simply victims of patriarchy. They were rulers in their own right, running estates, managing punishments, controlling lives, and sometimes joining together in unspoken alliances that revolved around black male slaves. These alliances, whispered about but rarely written down, were filthy power rings, secret understandings between mistresses, cousins, sisters, or visiting guests, women who shared methods of punishment, who whispered about desires too forbidden to be uttered aloud, who protected each other with silence when rumors threatened to surface. The polished parlor rooms, the sewing circles, the church meetings, these were sometimes the very places where masks of virtue hid the dirtiest of truths. Imagine the cruel irony. Black men painted by white society as dangerous, predatory, a threat to the sanctity of white womanhood. Yet in the shadows of these mansions, those same men were coerced, humiliated, and controlled by the very women society claimed they endangered. To resist was impossible. To refuse meant death. To speak was unthinkable. Silence was survival. Every glance could decide a man's fate. Looking too long at a mistress could mean accusation. Looking away could be read as defiance. Enslaved men walked on the edge of a blade, knowing that their bodies were property, their dignity disposable, their voices erased before they could even be spoken. And in that silence, the rings of cruelty grew. Some white women used enslaved men for unspeakable punishments, degrading rituals designed not to discipline, but to humiliate, to crush pride, to strip away manhood. Others, whispers suggest, crossed into darker territories, pulling men into secret chambers and coercing them into acts they could never refuse. These were not moments of intimacy. They were moments of domination, the filthy thrill of controlling a man who had no escape. If these secrets risked exposure, the lies were even nastier. Accusations of assault, fabricated stories of danger, cries for protection, all of it weaponized to shield the women's reputations while condemning black men to whippings, mutilations, or lynching. Innocent lives destroyed to cover filthy truths. Families ripped apart by a single accusation because society never questioned the word of a white woman. Behind it all lay the unspoken alliances. Women shielding one another, ensuring silence. A secret sisterhood of cruelty. They were bonded not by love, but by secrecy, by the shared knowledge that their desires and acts would never be spoken of publicly. They were, in their own way, architects of dirty conspiracies that weaponized enslaved men's very existence. The cost of these filthy power games fell entirely on the enslaved men. Imagine the torment of living in constant fear, knowing that any night a knock at the door or a whisper in the dark could drag you into something you could not refuse. Imagine the humiliation of being reduced not only to property in the fields, but to a disposable body in secret rooms. And imagine the heartbreak of being unable to speak, unable to warn your wife, your children, your brothers, because silence was the only shield you had. For black men, there was no safety. To resist a white woman's demand was to invite death. To comply meant carrying shame, terror, and the threat of exposure. They lived in double chains, the iron that bound their wrists and the invisible chains of silence that smothered their voices. Many were husbands and fathers, stripped of dignity and forced to carry wounds that would never heal. Their families bore the consequences: rumors, accusations, children lost to sales, men lynched for crimes they never committed. Every false whisper from a mistress's lips could destroy generations in an instant. The trauma was not only physical, but psychological. Men who had already been denied humanity were now denied manhood itself. Their dignity was stolen twice, once by the system of slavery, and again by the filthy obsessions of women whose society insisted were pure. That torment seeped deep into families, into songs sung in whispers, into stories buried in silence, into the inherited scars of generations. These wounds, though unseen, did not vanish. They bled forward in history, but silence never holds forever. Secrets leak through cracks, through whispers, through the courage of those who refuse to let the truth die. Slave narratives, written by men who risked everything to put words on paper, sometimes carried shadows of these stories. They did not always name the women, for the danger was too great, but the pain is clear between the lines. There are testimonies of men punished for crimes they never committed, of accusations made to hide filthy truths. There are hints of forced servitude that went beyond the fields. In rare and disturbing glimpses, diaries from white women themselves reveal fragments of these secrets. Confessions masked as laments, words written in private that expose obsessions they dared not speak aloud. In court records, the patterns emerge. Accusations of assault brought forth when women feared their secrets would spill, trials that ended in executions, the filthy cover-ups etched into official history. Modern science has pulled even more secrets into the light. DNA, cold and undeniable, reveals hidden lineages. Families discovering that their ancestry carries bloodlines no one admitted. That the children of enslaved men and white mistresses lived and died in silence. Each test becomes a crack in the polished facade of history, forcing truths into the open that white families fought to bury. And when these nasty truths began to surface, society recoiled. White descendants clung to denial, rewriting family histories, dismissing evidence, or retreating into silence. For black families, the revelations brought painful validation. Whispers from ancestors finally confirmed, but confirmation that reopened wounds. For historians, the exposure was a battlefield. Some resisted, unwilling to paint white women as predators, clinging to the myth of their fragility. Others fought to drag the truth out of the shadows, insisting that history must not only record the suffering inflicted by white men, but also the cruelty orchestrated by white women. Still, popular culture has remained largely silent. Films, textbooks, mainstream history, most stop short of naming the disturbing role of white women in the system of slavery. They show them as victims of patriarchal husbands, not as architects of filthy power games. They keep the narrative clean, polished, respectable, because the dirty truth is too disturbing, too unspeakable, too capable of shattering the myths society still clings to. But the question remains, why? Why did these women form such secret circles of cruelty? Why did they risk everything to create filthy conspiracies hidden in the shadows of plantations? Some argue it was power, the intoxication of control in a world that denied them authority. Others say it was fetish, a disturbing obsession with black male bodies, both feared and desired, forbidden yet irresistible. Still others see it as sadism, the cruel pleasure of domination disguised as discipline. Perhaps it was all of these at once: lust, fear, envy, and power, woven together into acts too filthy to be admitted, too cruel to be remembered. A plantation hall at night, the laughter of a dinner party fading as doors close. In a locked room upstairs, a man waits, his chains silent, his voice smothered by fear. A woman enters, draped in silk and pearls, the world believing she is pure, virtuous, fragile. But in this room, she is something else, an architect of cruelty, a keeper of dirty secrets. And when the door closes, history will look the other way, and yet the echoes remain. Behind every portrait of a Southern belle, behind every polished heirloom passed down in white families, there are screams that were silenced, lives that were broken, men who were destroyed by filthy lies. These are not just stories of the past. They are scars that shape the present, feeding the stereotypes, the fears, the myths that still shadow Black men today. The dirty rings of power did not vanish when slavery ended. Their legacy lived on in the ways Black men were criminalized, feared, and falsely accused for generations. The haunting truth is this: history may try to polish the past, but filthy secrets cannot stay buried forever. And when exposed, they remind us that behind every myth of purity lies a disturbing reality. The dirty power rings of white women broke hearts, shattered lives, and rewrote history with lies that still echo. So the question is not whether these secrets existed. The question is whether we have the courage to look them in the eye. When history refuses to tell the truth, how many hearts must break before we listen?